Welcome to this session called Theories of Second Language Acquisition, Learning Behaviourism. Language is a mirror of the mind in a deep and significant sense. It is a product of human intelligence created anew in each individual by operations that lie far beyond the reach of will or consciousness. This was stated by Chomsky in 1975. Learning a second language is defined as acquiring the ability to use its structure within a general vocabulary under essentially the conditions of normal communication among native speakers at conversational speed. There are some basic theories advanced to describe how language is acquired and taught. The behaviorist theory, mentalist theory, rationalist theory, otherwise called cognitive theory, empiricist theory, which is also called as audiolingualism, and cognitive code theory are some of these theories. Of these, behaviorist theory and mentalist theory are mainly applicable to the acquisition of native languages, while the rest can account for foreign language acquisition. Yet these five fundamental theories of language learning cannot be totally divorced from each other. Now let us move on to different theories related to second language acquisition. The first one is Thorndike's theory of trial and error learning. Edward L. Thorndike was the first psychologist who formally studied the consequences of behavior back in the late 1800s. In order to study the behavior, Thorndike experimented with animals. He created puzzle boxes. A hungry cat was put inside a box, and a tiny morsel of fish was kept outside. The cat made several attempts to come out of the box, like pushing its paw on the lever, biting a string with the teeth, or swishing its tail to open the door. At last, the cat pulled the loop in a particular manner and came out of the cage and got the fish. From this research, Thorndike learned that even though the cats probably did a particular behavior accidentally the first time, if that accidental behavior got rewarded, they were more likely to do it again the next time they were put in that box. Thorndike said that the behavior had been reinforced or made stronger due to the reward of escaping the box and getting food. Let us see the three fundamental concepts related to Thorndike's trial and error learning. Connectionist or behaviorist theories belong to the school of behaviourism. They interpret learning in terms of connection or association between stimulus and response. Stimulus is something causing or regarded as causing a response. Response is a reaction as that of an organism or a mechanism to a specific stimulus. Thorndike says both theory and practice need emphatic and frequent reminders that man's learning is frequently the action of the laws of readiness, exercise, and effect. The law of readiness. This law is indicative of the learner's state to participate in the learning process. Readiness, according to Thorndike, is preparation for action. The child learns quickly, effectively, and with greater satisfaction if he is ready to learn. This shows us not to force a child to learn if he is not ready, but to also not miss any opportunity of providing learning experiences if the child is prepared to learn. A clear objective and a good reason for learning something help to motivate students to learn. The law of exercise. This law has two subparts, the law of use and the law of disuse. The law of use. Practice makes perfect. Connections between a stimulus and a response are strengthened as they are used. Those things most often repeated are best learned. This is the basis for practice and drill. What about the law of disuse? Connections between a stimulus and a response are weakened as they are not used. It emphasizes that there should not be a long gap between one practice and the next, because long time disuse may lead to forgetting. Frequent tests should be taken to make the students practice the subject learned. Next is the law of effect. If the learning results in satisfaction and the learner derives pleasure from it, learning can be said to have taken place properly. The progress of learning is blocked in the situation when the child meets failure. Pleasant experiences have a lasting influence and unpleasant ones are soon forgotten. This law emphasizes the role of rewards and punishments in the process of learning. The second theory associated with the connectionism is Pavlov's theory of classical conditioning. While studying the functioning of the digestive system, a Russian psychologist named Ivan Pavlov encountered an unforeseen problem. The dogs in his experiment salivated not only upon actually eating, but also when it saw the food, or noticed the man who usually brought it, or even heard his footsteps. This led Pavlov to design a series of experiments in which he used a buzzer to condition the salivation in dogs. He started by sounding the buzzer each time food was given to the dogs and found that the dogs would start salivating immediately after hearing the buzzer, even before seeing the food. After a period of time, Pavlov began sounding the buzzer without giving any food at all and found that the dogs continued to salivate at the sound of the buzzer even in the absence of food. They had learned to associate the sound of the buzzer with being fed. Pavlov called this phenomenon, which he called as conditioning. Later, this theory was also known as the theory of classical conditioning. The third theory of conditioning is related to John B. Watson. Let us see the experiment performed by Watson. John B. Watson and the theory of conditioning. John B. Watson, the father of behaviorism, supported Pavlov's ideas on conditioned responses. Through his experiments, Watson tried to demonstrate the role of conditioning in producing as well as eliminating emotional responses such as fear. In 1921, Watson studied Albert to become afraid of a white rat by pairing the white rat with a very loud jarring noise. This was called UCS. At first, Albert showed no sign of fear when he was presented with rats, but once the rat was repeatedly paired with a loud noise, UCS, Albert developed a fear of the rats. It could be said that the loud noise or UCS induced fear or UCR. The implications of Watson's experiment suggested that classical conditioning could cause some phobias in humans. The theory of classical conditioning, emphasized by Pavlov and Watson, gave birth to a number of important concepts and principles in the field of learning, such as extinction, the process of gradual disappearance of the conditioned response or disconnection of the SR association is called extinction. Spontaneous recovery. It was also discovered by Pavlov that after extinction, when a conditioned response is no longer evident, the behavior often reappears spontaneously but at a reduced intensity. This process of spontaneous recovery suggests that learning is suppressed rather than forgotten. Stimulus generalization. Watson's Albert showed a fear not only of touching a rabbit but also of the mere sight of a rabbit, a white fur coat, or even Santa Claus whiskers. Responding to the stimuli in such a generalized way is known as stimulus generalization. Stimulus discrimination. It is a mechanism in which one learns to react only to a single specific stimulus out of the multiplicity of stimuli, and to distinguish and discriminate one from the other among a variety of stimuli present in our environment. Educational implications of the theory are: a teacher with his defective methods of teaching or improper behavior may condition a child to develop distaste and hatred towards him, the subject he teaches, and even the school environment. On the contrary, affection, a loving attitude and sympathetic treatment given to a child by the parents at home or by the teachers at school may produce a desirable impact on him through the process of conditioning. Thus, much of our behavior in the shape of interests, attitudes, habits, sense of application or criticism, moods and temperaments is fashioned through conditioning. The process of conditioning not only helps in learning what is desirable, but also helps in eliminating, avoiding or unlearning of undesirable habits, unhealthy attitudes, superstitions, fear and phobias through deconditioning. Classical conditioning is quite different from operant conditioning. We can move on to the next theory, that is Skinner's theory of operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is a theory of behaviorism that focuses on changes in an individual's observable behaviors. For conducting the experiments with rats, Skinner designed a special apparatus known as Skinner's box. The darkened soundproof box has a grid floor, a system of light or sound produced at the time of delivery of a pellet of food in the food cup, a lever and a food cup. Skinner would place the rats in a Skinner box with a lever attached to a feeding tube. Whenever a rat pressed the lever, food would be released. After the experience of multiple trials, the rats learned the association between the lever and the food and began to spend more of their time in the box procuring food than performing any other action. He discovered that the rate of response as well as the changes in response features depended on what occurred after the behavior was performed and not before. Skinner named these actions operant behaviors because they operated on the environment to produce an outcome. In his experiments with pigeons, Skinner made use of another specific apparatus called the pigeon box. A pigeon in his experiment had to peck at a lighted plastic key mounted on the wall at head height and was consequently rewarded with grain. Important concepts in operant conditioning. Shaping. When the desired responses do not occur at random, efforts are directed at eliciting the appropriate responses. This is done by building a chain of responses called shaping. It may be used as a successful technique for training individuals to learn difficult and complex behavior and also for introducing desirable modifications in their behavior. Chaining. It refers to a process in the shaping of behavior and the learning of a task where the required behavior or task is broken down into smaller steps for its effective learning and subsequent reinforcement. Discrimination and cueing. Cues or signals indicate which behavior will be reinforced and which behavior will be punished. The process of discrimination has wide applications in the field of instruction and behavior modification. Due care should be taken to provide proper feedback on the correctness or incorrectness of responses. Generalization. Generalization refers to the ability of an organism dealing with the perception of and response to similar stimuli. The parents and teachers should reinforce the behavior of the children only after they demonstrate the ability to generalize correctly. We have come across 4 important theories related to second language acquisition. Now we can see how these theories are implemented in the field of teaching and learning of a second language. Language learning as a behavioral skill. In the light of the theories put forward by the psychologists of behaviorist school, learning a language can be explained in terms of conditioning. Operant conditioning is more applicable than classical conditioning. In the early life of a child, it hears a number of sounds. It tries to associate these sounds with situations. For example, the mother produces certain sounds when she feeds the child. Afterwards, the child is happy when it hears the sounds, even though there is no food. At this stage, conditioning has taken place. The more frequent the child is exposed to this process of conditioning, the stronger will be the bond between the sound and the situation. The strength of this associative bond also depends on the satisfaction which the child gets from the conditioning process. Afterwards, the child learns to produce sounds. It imitates some of the speech sounds. This is the result of the child's attempt to control the environment. Suppose a child wants the mother to feed it. To get the desired response from the mother, the child has to produce a certain stimulus. It cries. It produces a number of sounds. One of them may be milk. This acts as a proper stimulus and the mother responds to it. She feeds the child. Here, the child is driven by an internal stimulus, hunger. It acts by producing a number of utterances. One of them is the appropriate stimulus for the mother. She responds. The child is rewarded. Reinforcement takes place. The behavior pattern gets reinforced. The inappropriate behavior patterns have been neglected. When the behavior pattern is reinforced, the bond of association is immediately formed. The child comes to understand the connection between the word milk and the response feeding. This bond of association is strengthened through repetition. At the same time, the behavior patterns which are not rewarded will get extinguished. The teacher of a language has to stimulate this natural process of language learning. It may be noted that little children can learn a number of languages if they are placed in suitable situations. For a language teacher, the following implications of behaviorist model of learning are important. Number 1. Language cannot be taught diverse from situation. The teacher has to introduce each new pattern in a meaningful situation. Number 2. Producing the correct linguistic response to stimulus requires effort. If the learner is not called upon to make this effort, there is no learning. Number 3. Attention is also necessary to produce the correct response. Prolonged practices will slacken attention. So, spaced practice is better than prolonged practice. Meaningless and mechanical repetition will not produce learning. Number 4. Spoken language comes earlier than written language. So, passive or receptive experience of language is necessary before any active use can begin. Number 5. Learning takes place fast if the correct response to the stimulus is confirmed. The learner must know at once if his effort is right or wrong. Number 6. Learning is faster if the learner is placed in a situation where he can produce only the correct response. Each incorrect response builds up a faculty behavior pattern which interferes with the process of conditioning. 7. Each new item learned must be reinforced by further practice before further learning takes place. 8. Language is learned only through use or practice. The methodology used over the past 40 or 50 years was based on the assumptions of behaviorism. They emphasized repeated and spaced practice of language materials in meaningful situations. It was also suggested that oral practice should be followed by written exercise. It's time to conclude the session. This module discusses the behaviorist learning theories. Classical or respondent conditioning is based on respondent behavior. Specifically, it deals with responses that invariably follow a specific stimulus and are thus elicited. On the other hand, operant conditioning helps in conditioning or learning of operant behavior that is emitted. In this type of learning, much emphasis is placed on the response rather than the stimulus causing response. Implications of the behaviorist theories in language learning is also explored. Before we attend the next session, please try to answer the following questions. Distinguish between classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Bring out the implications of behaviorist learning from your classroom teaching. Write any 5 linguistic principles. Write any 5 educational implications of behaviorist model of learning in the field of language learning. Here are some books for your reference. Psychology, written by D. Bockham in Barron's Educational Series, published in 1996. Understanding Behaviorism, Behavior, Culture and Evolution, written by W. M. Baum and published by Wiley Blackwell in the year 2005. Ways of Learning, Learning Theories and Learning Styles in the Classroom, written by A. Pritchard and published by David Fulton in the year 2005. Are Theories of Learning Necessary? Written by B. F. Skinner, which came out in Psychological Review in the year 1950. With that, we come to the end of the session. Hope it was useful. Till we meet again in the next session, it's a goodbye from all of us here.